Good afternoon and good evening to you all, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name is David Wellman, and as the director of the Gray School of Applied Diplomacy at DePaul University, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the second day of our conference, Diplomacy and the Future of Democracy, Transprofessional Responses to Contemporary Diplomatic Challenges. The mission of the Gray School is to train future practitioners of diplomacy across all vocations, from those pursuing careers in the Foreign Service to those who want to build bridges as NGO leaders, private sector actors, scientists, artists, religious leaders, community organizers, and activists. Our goal is to create cohorts of students with a wide range of vocational trajectories who engage the study and practice of diplomacy together, and in so doing, establish networks that they will take with them as they pursue or redirect their respective careers upon graduation. Examining the transprofessional diplomatic work which is currently taking place and which must now be amplified in the name of supporting democracy is the theme of our conference. To this end, we would like to invite everyone who joins us for this conference to consider themselves part of our global Gray School cohort. We are so grateful for the opportunity to learn from you and with you, and we look forward to doing so long into the future. Today, we will begin with a keynote by Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation, entitled The Ukraine War, Lessons for Democracy and Diplomacy. This talk will take place in the form of a dialogue between Professor McFaul and the Gray School's Jeffrey Wiseman. Our opening keynote will be followed by our first panel of the day, entitled Global Public Health, Diplomacy and Democracy, featuring 3 Chicago-based scholars and practitioners of diplomacy. That panel will then be followed by a keynote address by Walaa al-Bushi, the former Minister of Youth and Sport of Sudan, entitled Diplomacy and the Struggle for Democracy in Modern Sudan. Our conference will then conclude with a panel entitled Diplomacy and Democracy on the Ground, the Work of Global Citizen Diplomats, featuring practitioners and scholars from Uganda, the United States, and Peru. We hope that you'll be able to attend all of these. At this point, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Jeff Wiseman, who will be introducing this morning's opening keynote. Jeff?
Thanks, David, and what a pleasure it is for me to introduce our speaker. Michael McFaul is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Professor McFaul is also an analyst for NBC News and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. Professor McFaul served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council, and then as US Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014. He has several authored and edited books, most recently the New York Times bestseller, From Cold War to Hot Peace, an American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. His other books include topics such as Russia's Unfinished Revolution, political change from Gorbachev to Putin, advancing democracy abroad, and transitions to democracy. Professor McFaul's current research interests include American foreign policy, great power relations between China, Russia, and the US, and the relationship between democracy and development. Mike was born and raised in Montana. He received his MA in Soviet and East European Studies from Stanford University. As a Rhodes Scholar, he completed his doctorate in International Relations at Oxford University, and he joins us today from Sicily, Italy. Now, the format of this session is first a dialogue, as David Wellman mentioned, in which I will be putting questions to Professor McFaul about the Ukraine war and the lessons for democracy and diplomacy, and second, we will have a Q&A session. Now, to our conference participants, you can direct your questions to the speakers via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. Now, a very warm welcome to you, Mike. And if I may, I'd like to group my questions in terms of 3 interconnected artificial phases of the war, if you like. First of all, its causes, then its conduct, and finally, and hopefully, its termination. Now, allow me to kick off our conversation by looking at the war's causes, by asking you about Vladimir Putin and what might explain his decision to go to war in February 2022. Now, I refer first to tee this question up a little bit, in your international security exchange with Elias Gertz in 2021, writing about your earlier 2020 article on Putinism and the domestic determinants of Russian foreign policy, you wrote that multiple factors, power, regimes, individuals, and ideas can influence outcomes simultaneously. Now, a part of the argument that struck me was the following comment from you. The Putin that I met in 1991 had a very different worldview than Putin in 2021. Now, I wonder if you could describe for us the evolution of Putin's thinking or worldview in terms of, first, the domestic developments inside Russia over that period, and secondly, the international developments outside Russia, including the hot button issue of NATO expansion. A fairly simple question to kick things off. Thanks very much, Mike.
Well, Jeff, thanks for having me. I literally could speak for 2 or 3 hours on that question. It's a very big, hard question. And I don't have a simple answer, but I'll take a stab at it. We'll just keep talking. And if you don't like my answer, you can push back again. It's complicated for a couple of reasons. One, as you already noted, and thank you for reading my work, by the way. That's the greatest honor one can ever give anybody. I usually joke at book talks, thank you for buying my book. I don't care if you read it. But in the case of international security in a journal like that, it is a real, that's what I do want people like you to read. So thank you for doing that. And what I argue in that piece, and what I truly believe, of course, is that the search for a unicausal explanation for big things like war and peace, that sometimes is prejudiced and privileged in political science, in the academy, a simple argument, one causal thing that you can really isolate. That is not the way I think the world that I know and study works. And one has to be comfortable with looking at multiple factors, even if that means you don't have a precise explanation to show cause and effect. But in the case that you're asking me about, I do think there are multiple factors, right? So power matters. To say something simple, I hope obvious to everybody, if Russia had the power of Moldova, Russia wouldn't have the capability to invade Ukraine, so we wouldn't be talking about war, just to state the obvious, right? But I don't think power explains everything, because I can think of some powerful countries that don't invade their neighbors. I can think of countries that become more powerful that don't go to war. Think of Japan and Germany after World War II. And even countries that do go to war, like my own country, the United States, we go to war not to annex our neighbors, and the kinds of outcomes that we are seeking are different than what Putin's doing. So power matters, but it's not the whole story. Second, I'll take these in sequence, NATO expansion. So second argument is that this is all about us, our policies, and Putin just had to push back. And again, just like with the power argument, there's some truth to it, but it doesn't explain everything. It is also, I think, a fairly, statement of fact that managing relations between NATO and Russia have been a major challenge for diplomats for the last 30 years, and arguably, since the creation of NATO back in 1949. It has been a source of tension in that relationship. But why I don't think it tells the whole story, a couple of reasons. One is the drama and the level of conflict between NATO and Russia has not been some kind of linear progression that's gotten worse and worse and worse. It's been more zigzaggy over the last 30 years. It hasn't been a constant, it's been a variable. And I'm just going to paraphrase right now, but I can send them around. I have written about these, so I have the quotes later in the chat or somewhere. Let me quote some Russian strategists about NATO. One of them said in 2000, when asked about whether Russia should join NATO, he said, why, yeah, that's a great idea. Why not? I don't see why there should be any problem with that. You know who that strategist was? His name was Vladimir Putin. That was in 2000, after the first wave of NATO expansion. A couple of years later, as the Bush administration had already announced and was preparing to push forward the big bang of NATO expansion, right? In 2002, another great strategist talking about Ukraine said, well, that's their business if they want to join NATO or not my problem. Again, That was Vladimir Putin, not Mike McFaul, not George W. Bush, not some liberal opposition figure in Moscow. That was Vladimir Putin. And a decade later, or nearly a decade later, I was actually at a NATO summit in Portugal. Fantastic meeting, a very historic meeting in some ways. And another Russian grand strategist was there. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, but this is all in the public domain, the threat, the animosity between NATO and Russia is over. We are in a new historic moment. And behind closed doors, sounds kind of incredible now to think about, given where we're at. That particular grand strategist, his name is Dmitry Medvedev, president of Russia. He was talking with my boss at the time, Barack Obama, about missile defense cooperation with NATO and Russia. So hold on, there's got to, and that was after, Bucharest, that was after NATO, Georgia conversations that took place in the 2008 Bucharest summit. So my point here is it's a variable, not a constant, and it goes up and down, shaped by other factors. The other thing I would say just on NATO is in the run-up to this tragic, horrific war, I would just note that there was no threat of NATO attacking Russia. There was no, right around the corner moment that Ukraine was going to join NATO. That was well understood by Putin, Bush, people in Brussels, and President Zelensky himself. I hosted President Zelensky last summer. Therefore, this idea that he had to invade them to stop NATO expansion towards Ukraine, I just don't think there's a factual basis for that. And that gets me to my third variable that you already asked about, which is, I think, again, power matters and the Western relationship matters, but the real driver of this conflict, I think, is Russian domestic politics. And cut me off if I go on too long, because this is a long story. But I want to remind people tuning in today that Vladimir Putin was an accidental president. There was no groundswell of support for him back in 2000. People didn't even know who he was then. He was chosen by President Yeltsin and then ratified by the Russian people. And I tell you that because back then we didn't know what his ideas about NATO were. We didn't know what his ideas about market or democracy were. I used to follow Russian politics pretty closely back then. I didn't know much about him. I'd met him, by the way, Jeff, in 1991, in the spring of 91 in St. Petersburg, when he was working for a very pro-democratic, pro-Western mayor, Anatoly Sobchak. So forgive me for being confused that he would become this anti-Western guy he became later. And I start with that because I want people to remember that this was not, he didn't come in saying we're going to get in a war with NATO and we're anti-democratic and anti-Western. I quoted him from 2000 saying he wanted to join NATO. By the way, back then he was very pro-market and he wanted Western investment back then. What he wasn't was pro-democracy early on. And the longer he stayed in power, the more autocratic Russia became. And that began to create tensions between an autocratic Russia and the democratic West. And I shouldn't use the word West, but just the democratic countries. And then they were punctuated, and I think this is the critical thing, punctuated by what I would call democratic breakthroughs and what Putin would call CIA orchestrated coups. Actually starts in Serbia in 2000, then Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. And those are, like I said, those were moments of democratic mobilization against autocratic regimes, but Putin always saw a sinister American hand behind this. And I'm not making this up. I sat with him the first time he met with President Obama in the summer of 2009, where he explained this to President Obama. And he said, the deep hand, the deep state, you're always going out and overthrowing regimes you don't like. And let's be honest, he had some empirical data to support that hypothesis, right? He was mostly talking back then about the Iraq War. But Obama said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not doing that. We're not going to be using military force to overthrow regimes. That was 2009. And then, Jeff, what happened? As you know well, the Arab Spring happened. And again, I want to be clear, we didn't try to overthrow those regimes in the beginning. We were reacting to what people on the ground were doing in Tunisia first, then Egypt, then later Syria, and then later Libya. But in Putin's worldview, this was again the United States fomenting revolution, overthrowing regimes we don't like. And then at the end of that year, 2011, it happened in his country. Hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Moscow to protest a falsified election. And in his worldview, that was us again, CIA, America. And by the way, Jeff, that's right when I parachuted into Moscow to become the new US ambassador. And so he blamed me personally, and sometimes very personally, you know, in sitting in rooms with him, for being sent by Barack Obama to foment revolution against him. And then 2 years later, and I'll stop on this, same event happened, new country, this time Ukraine. The Ukrainians call it the Revolution of Dignity. He calls it a neo-Nazi coup. And so he first tried to overthrow that coup. That's when he annexed Crimea. That's when he supported the separatists in Donbass. There was an interlude in the Trump era, we can get back to if you're interested, where he thought he might have other means to achieve his objectives of overthrowing that, again, democratic government, what he calls a neo-fascist regime. But then after waiting, thinking maybe he could negotiate with Zelensky, waiting for our elections, maybe he thought he could negotiate with Trump when Trump wasn't elected. Then I think he decided to go in with the explicit goal, and you don't have to believe me, he said it to his people on the night before invading, of, you know, what he called overthrowing the neo-Nazis that are in charge of Ukraine. I call them democratically elected regime. And so the real drama here is Russia becomes more autocratic, tension with the democratic world, and then tension with the democratic country on his borders. One last thing, if you'll forgive me for going on for so long, but I think it's really important. Putin has an argument inside Russia that Russians are different from Europe, that they're different from liberal democratic countries around the world. He makes that argument as one of his ways to legitimate his rolling back of democratic practices in his country. And, you know, I remember when it really hit me over the top of my, you know, just jarringly, was when I was in a meeting with him. I was working at the White House at the time. I was traveling to Moscow with then Vice President Biden. And in that meeting with Prime Minister Putin, that they were meeting, got a little testy about Georgia, as I recall. And Putin said to Vice President Biden, by the way, Jeff, because we're speaking about diplomacy, Putin always comes really well prepared for these meetings. He's not drifting in and kind of doing it on the fly. He's thought hard about what he's doing. Nothing happens by accident in these meetings, at least the ones that I was in over 5 years when I served in the government. And he turned to Biden, and I'm leaning in because he leaned in. You want a dramatic effect. And he said, you know, you guys look at us. And he went like this. And you look at us and you see that we have the same skin, color skin. And so you think we think like you. He said, we don't think like you. We're different. And he's trying to say, you know, we're not part of, you know, your world. We're different. And that's part of his argument back home. But the Ukrainians make a big problem with that, because President Putin has also said Ukrainians are just like us. They say the same culture, the same heritage. They're just Russians with accents. Well, hold on. If they're just like you, but they're practicing democracy, that is a threat to his argument back home. And that, I think, is another part of why his obsession with democratic Ukraine that's gone on for a long time. But that I think was another part of the reason why he decided to invade.
Thanks so much, Mike. I think that's a very useful reminder of the importance of domestic politics. And I think your international security argument makes that point, while, you know, being very, very careful to look for multiple explanations of any war, if you like. So Thanks very much for that. I wondered if we could move from the causes of the war to the conduct of the war. And again, this is ongoing. News is coming in daily. But I wanted to ask you about the nuclear danger to start off with. And it seems to me that there are basically two big issues at stake. First of all, there is the danger of a serious Chernobyl-like accident at Zaporizhzhia, at the nuclear power plant, one of the biggest, I believe, in Europe. And the second one is Putin's scarcely veiled threats to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So I wonder if you could have a go at both of those, you know, the threat of a nuclear accident and the threat of actual nuclear weapons use.
Yeah, again, very hard questions that I don't have clear answers to. Let me say, by way of a preambular statement about the conduct of the war, I think it's important for people to understand there are things that are very, very different about this war that you have to usually go back to World War II to find similar things. So first, this is the biggest conventional war in Europe since World War II. Second, this is the first major annexation in Europe for sure. And with some exceptions, we can think of, there are a handful of exceptions, but really since World War II, this is this kind of war for annexation. That's also something new. In many ways, we fought World War II to stop annexation. It's also a war of recolonization. We haven't had recolonization forever. So all of those things are new. And then in terms of the specter part, I think this is the most dangerous moment for great power war that we've had since 1939. We could quibble about that. We can go back to the Korean War maybe, but it's most certainly on par. And with respect to the nuclear threat, I actually think it's the greatest threat since the last time nuclear weapons were used in 1945. People like to invoke the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that is the wrong metaphor for this moment that we're in now. I think it's much scarier. Khrushchev was trying to get out of a conflict. Putin is threatening to make the conflict bigger. So these are scary times. I want to say that before I sound dismissive of the threat. I think these are, for me, without question, the scariest times of my lifetime on all of those fronts. That said, let me say a few, what is my best guesses, and I really want to underscore I'm guessing. I've known Putin for a long time. I've written a lot about him. I dealt with him for 5 years in the US government, but we're not Facebook friends. He's not asking me for advice about what to do on these things. And I joke about that, but I also, as somebody who did work in the government and devoured American intelligence about Putin for 5 years, and I know that those working on it now, the head of the CIA is a good friend of mine, former ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns. I would also just say he is a really hard target for us to know what he's thinking. One, because he's an intelligence officer and he's not doing Zoom calls or talking on telephones. So for intelligence agencies, he's hard. But two, Jeff, he's very isolated in the world right now. So we don't have a lot of triangulation to get a feel for how he's thinking. I remember when I was ambassador, for instance, we would try to talk to his interlocutors as well as talk to him. And those sources have dried up. There are not a lot of people talking to him. So that's another caveat that I'm guessing. But let me give you my best guess. Let me take the first one. Let me reverse the order, because the accident question I'm not as expert on. On the intentional use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, I still think the probabilities of that are very, very low. And by the way, it's the job of intelligence officers to make that assessment. It's the job of diplomats and foreign policymakers then to change that assessment, right? So even if it's 1%, it's the job of President Biden and Secretary Blinken and everybody on the team to get it to 0.8, 0.7, 0.5, 0.3, 0.2. And I think they're doing that. I hope they're doing things that we can't see. But I think it's low for a couple of reasons. In fact, I would group them under one heading and then go through it. I don't see the utility of that action. I don't see a military or political utility. So let's take the war itself. A lot of people think 1945, we used nuclear weapons against Japan. Afterwards, they capitulated, they surrendered, and people use that metaphor to say, well, Putin will use these nuclear weapons and it'll end the war. I see no reason to believe that this would end the war. I actually think exactly the opposite, that Ukrainians, President Zelensky and his entire society would want to double down their military efforts in the event of that. And I think they would take the war to Russia if they did that. You know, and I think there's more capabilities there than we know that they have not used very deliberetely. They've been constrained. I do not think they would be constrained. So Ukrainians, exact opposite response. The West, I don't think the reaction from President Biden is going to be, well, now that he's used nuclear weapons, we better stop arming the Ukrainians. You know, imagine that Oval Office speech. The night after a nuclear weapon has been used, we're going to say, okay, you know, we're now afraid of this guy and we're going to stop. That can't happen. I don't even think politically that could happen. You know, I used to write speeches for the president, and I've talked about this with people in the Biden administration. That is not a speech any president's going to make. It's going to be the opposite. Here's what we're going to do in response. And on the military side, I would say two things. One, right now, Putin is deterring the West with his nuclear threats from giving the most capable weapon systems. So there's a reason for his threatening. By the way, he's achieving objectives on that. But if he uses the nuclear weapons, then that deterrence is over. So the ATACMS, these long-range missile systems, which the government has, our government has decided not to give, I think they would give them. The MiG-29s, if you remember, you know, all the kerfuffle about that, we decided not to give them. The NATO alliance, I think there would be no reason not to. Patriots, et cetera. I just think there would be an all-in. I also think, you know, the resistance of the Biden administration to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism and the comprehensive set of sanctions that goes with that, there will be tons of pressure from Congress to do that. And then third, I don't know, but I most certainly know whether they do it or not, but I most certainly know that they haven't taken off the table a kinetic conventional response from the United States, from NATO. And, you know, those debates go in two different ways. One, do you do a kinetic strike against the folks and the base that launched that tactical nuclear weapon? That's one thing you could do. Or two, you could go after Russian military targets in Ukraine, right? So not against Russia, but in Ukraine. And I think there would be a lot of pressure to pursue that option. And then third, you know, a lot of the world, as you know, as well as I, has been sitting on the sidelines, right? 40 countries, I think, abstained in the last vote on the United Nations to denounce annexation. Tragic in my mind that there's so many, but I understand the calculus. I don't think any of those countries, China, Russia, China and India, for instance, South Africa, these are all countries that are firmly against the use of nuclear weapons. Then I think they get off the fence if Putin uses a nuclear weapon. And finally, I wonder how many Russians would support that, either in society or in his own inner circle. I don't think there'd be that many. So that makes me, you know, if you're thinking about the rational use of nuclear weapons to achieve an objective, I don't think there's much of a case for it. What I don't know is, does Putin have the same assessments of all those three things that I just described?
Thanks, Mike. That's a very sophisticated answer. And I take your point about Zaporizhzhia as well. We'll come back to that later. if possible. But you did mention there global, the lack of global support for the annexation resolution at the UN yesterday or the day before. But this leads me to the question about President Zelensky and his role. Now, in contrast to Putin's reputation, which has absolutely plummeted, of course, in most Western countries, Zelensky's star has risen like nothing else that I think I've ever seen. It's been astronomical, really. And what has been really striking for me is the way he's used public outreach, public diplomacy to international Western parliaments and assemblies, the Congress, the UN, the Security Council, and the GA. He has actually, in my sense, he's really been quite brilliant at that. And it's designed, I suppose, less for public diplomacy purposes, but more to just make sure that the West, the international community, keeps supporting him. But I wondered if you could tell us what your assessment of Zelensky's wartime leadership is, bearing in mind that he is a democratically elected president, who, during the impeachment problems a couple of years ago, he looked like a very unsure leadership, talking to people like Trump and others. But now, in terms of mobilizing the armed forces of his country impressively, mobilizing his people, and generating pretty impressive international support, it's pretty hard to fault it. But I wonder what your assessment of his wartime leadership is on those sort of criteria.
So let me say a couple things. First, I think it is important to underscore what you just said about Zelensky before the war. He was an actor on TV playing an accidental president, and then he became an accidental president. The public opinion polling in Ukraine made very clear that an outsider was going to win, and it was going to be one of those kind of elections. There was another candidate, by the way, that everybody thought was going to run and capture that opposition vote. His name's Slava Vakarchuk. He's the Mick Jagger of Ukraine. He's the most famous musician there. And then he decided to pull out, and that's how Zelensky, he captured that vote with no political background, had not been a member of a party. And when I hosted him at Stanford a summer and a half ago, right? So September of 2021. It is a democracy, and there was lots of criticism of the way he was ruling, and it was a pretty rough and tumble time. Democratic politics in Ukraine have been that way for a long time. He had done some controversial things, including some anti-Russian things, closing down pro-Russian media, for instance, that made people nervous about his leadership. But the war did transform his reputation at home, without question. I think it was a, just absolutely consequential decision that he made against the advice of many Western leaders, by the way, to stay in Kiev. That when he made that decision, not to flee to Krakow in Poland as government in exile. First, he survived that. That was not a trivial matter. Many plots to kill him, but that was a monumental decision that bought him a lot of goodwill. And then secondly, I think he has been a very impressive leader inside his country. He understands the gravity of the situation, and he's risen to it. Third, to your point about the outside world, yes, they have a very smart public diplomacy strategy. And it's very instrumental, by the way. It's not just to get people to applaud and make them feel good. They have a theory that societies, many democratic societies, the people are ahead of their leaders in terms of support for Ukraine. They think that about many countries in Europe. They think about it in the United States. And so by mobilizing society, it's keeping pressure on the governments to do the right things, especially vis-a-vis weapons and vis-a-vis sanctions. It's not accidental. It's very strategic. And, here's where his talents from his previous life come in handy. He's a fantastic performer. And I say that as a compliment. We hosted him again at Stanford last May on a Zoom call, And, his speech was one that you would recognize, but his interaction with our students was one of the most moving events I've ever hosted, Jeff. Just incredible how he interacted with them, how he joked with them, and how he connected to people, over a Zoom call. It's hard to do talks on Zoom calls, right? I'm doing one right now. I'm yelling. I'm trying to add energy to this space. It's hard. It's two-dimensional. And he somehow pulled it off. Just one other anecdote about it. I was in Philadelphia, invited by Speaker Pelosi to speak to a Democratic Party retreat. There were over 200 members of Congress at this retreat. And my talk was that evening. And I usually talk to Ukrainians, most days. And by the way, we've trained 200 Ukrainians through various programs we have at Stanford. So we have this very deep alumni network inside the country. One of them, Sergei Lashenko is his name, works for Zelensky. So just to get ready for my talk, to prepare, I set up a call to talk to Sergei. And he said, Mike, why don't I get you on the phone with the chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, he could give you the latest on the war, so I could then go perform 2 hours later to these members of Congress. So I got on it was a Skype call, not a Zoom call, and I clicked on my button just like I did with you just a few minutes ago. And, as the picture appeared, instead of Lashenko and Yermak, it was President Zelensky in his bunker. This is March, just a few weeks into the war. And, he said with that gravelly voice, he said, Mike, you look great. You look just like you did at Stanford. And I said, Mr. President, you look a lot different. He had on his, scraggly beard and his green T-shirt. By the way, he loved Stanford, as most people do. And before the war, we were collaborating on how to launch a university like Stanford in Ukraine. But after all, the pleasantries of that, we talked about the war. And, 2 hours later, I got up in front of members of Congress, and you wouldn't be surprised that the tone of what I said changed rather considerably after a chat with President Zelensky in his bunker, right? And that was brilliant on his, he knew that I was speaking before those members of Congress, and he took that time to chat with me, to catch up, but in a very, I would say, emotional way, and that mattered. It changed the way I spoke, and it changed the way Speaker Pelosi reacted to my talk, and I would say a series of things happened as a result of that. And so that they're very good at that, and I think other countries, by the way, should study how they're doing public diplomacy. I don't think we're very good at public diplomacy. You and I have chatted about this before. I think we've got to get smarter about it, and why that we have not convinced a lot of people in the global South that this is a war of imperialism, for instance. I think that's a failure of public diplomacy, and we should study how the Ukrainians are doing it.
Yes, you did do an op-ed in the Washington Post a few months ago, basically lambasting the administration for not putting enough effort into its public diplomacy effort. The idea of actually learning some lessons from the Ukrainians, I think, is really a nice point. So I love that. And I want to move on to the aftermath, or the end of the war, however we like to classify it. But I think on sheer humanitarian grounds, there's no doubt that, look, everyone wants this war to finish soon. But on strategic grounds, Ukraine seems willing to keep fighting, and actually seems to think that it can win, or at least get to a point where it has a reasonably strong hand when the war's end is negotiated. Now, my good colleague, J.D. Bindernagel, former ambassador and professor at Bonn University, sent us a very comprehensive email about a new article that he's just written in German, I hasten to add, which I haven't read, that considers two basic scenarios. And I'm sure that JD would like to share it with you and any participants who are interested. And the two scenarios, as he describes them, are one, the defeat of Ukraine, and two, the defeat of Russia. Now, what I wanted to do was look at those two possibilities, at the end of a continuum of possible outcomes, if you like, and probe the murky middle ground. So that let's assume war weariness leads to an uneasy peace. No one really wins decisively. And things finish up militarily roughly where they are, but perhaps with the Ukrainians taking a little more ground and being in a stronger position than they are as of today. So I guess my question is, first of all, as things, if the war were to finish roughly on today's terms, should Ukraine give up on Crimea, its claims to Crimea, if only tacitly? Should it limit its claims in the Donbass to certain parts, limited parts, if you like, let's say the pre-annexation of last week, for argument's sake? Or should Ukraine go for broke and make a claim for a return to the pre-2014 borders, including Crimea? So that, I wondered if you could have a go at that in terms of Crimea, and then I wanted to finish up or move on next to the question of what kind of defense security arrangements Ukraine should have in terms of membership with NATO, etc. But if you could have a go at the negotiating position as things appear now.
Yeah, another big hard question. You haven't given me any small, easy questions so far. I hope we're going to end on one. So let me say a couple of things, kind of concentric circles, before I get to the hardest part about the actual negotiations. On the big strategic piece, my view right now is that Ukraine has already won the war. Now, these are not black and white things. Historians get to decide, they write who won, who lost. But if you think about what Putin said he was seeking to accomplish, I think right now he's lost 5 and he's still trying to get the last one on his list, right? So I'll just go through them quickly. And this is him. He said all this very publicly. I really encourage people to read Putin. There's a lot translated if you don't speak Russian. There's so much speculation about what Putin thinks in the academic world. I've debated some. John Mersheimer in particular always talks about what Putin thinks, and it's clear to me he's not reading what Putin says. So at least do that. He said, number one, I'm going to unite Ukrainians and Russians. Remember, he published a 7,000-word article explaining why Russians and Ukrainians are not separate peoples. They share the same history. And by the way, it's a murky, complicated story, which I'm not going to try to go through right now, but he told that story, and he was going to use force to finally unite these. And by the way, he blamed the Bolsheviks, not just the West, for dividing them. He was going to unite them. Clearly, he hasn't done that. 2, just the opposite, help to create a Ukrainian identity that's more separate from Russia than probably any time in their history. Number 2, he said he was going to denazify Ukraine. And by that, he meant overthrow the Zelensky government, right? The democratically elected president of Ukraine, by the way, with Jewish heritage, by the way, whose first language is Russian. He learned Ukrainian second, but somehow he's a Nazi, and Putin was going to overthrow him and liberate. Obviously, failed at that. Number 3, demilitarization. Failed at that. Ukraine's way more militarized today than they were before. Number 4, he had, in the beginning of the war, as you recall, he had plans to occupy the whole place. Lost at that very dramatically, right? People forget the Battle of Kiev, but he lost the Battle of Kiev a long time ago. And now he's lost the Battle of Kharkiv in this counteroffensive. That objective has no chance. Well, right now, it seems very, very long odds to achieve that. Number 5 or 4, I can't remember which one I'm on. He said he was doing this to stop NATO expansion. This war has done exactly that. It's expanded NATO, exactly the opposite of what he alleged he was doing. So now we're down to the last piece, what he calls the special military operation for the defense of Donbass, right? Zashita Donbassa. He did not use that phrase, by the way, in February and March. He used a different phrase. He added those 2 words, in defense of Donbass. In Russian, it's 2 words, later down the road. And Jeff, I don't know how that ends, because he then did a very escalatory thing. Had he just stayed in Donbass, and had he just even tried to annex those two regions, right? That could have created parameters for one set of negotiations, but he overreached, right? He annexed two more, Zaporizhia, and I'm happy to come back to Zaporizhia in a minute. I forgot to answer that, the nuclear power plant there, and Kherson, two places that he doesn't control right now, and two places that have been living, people there have been living in Ukraine in a way that they were living under these paramilitary guys supported by Putin in the other two, Lugansk and Donetsk, right? So that was a major escalation. And then he said, okay, and now I'm happy to negotiate. And that puts, I think, Zelensky in a very hard position. Because before he had done that, I think it would have been very hard for Zelensky to negotiate, but not impossible to say, after, like you said, after a stalemate, right? I just left aside those two. Ukraine wins, Russia wins. Those are obviously the war ends in different terms in those places, but I don't think either of those are very probable. So I think the murky space that you steered us toward is the right place. I can imagine a negotiation to agree to disagree about the borders of Crimea and Donbass, but agree to only do unification peacefully. It's just almost impossible for me to believe that Zelensky could throw in Kherson and Zaporizhia. So I tragically, as a result of Putin's escalation, I think it makes it more likely that the Ukrainians will fight until they've made a real go at liberating all of their territory. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope, I don't hope I'm wrong. I'm going to leave that hope is, I'm going to set that aside, but I think it's become a lot harder. Number two, as to what should be done, I feel very strongly as an American that it is not my place to tell Ukrainians what should be done with respect to their territory. When I hear Ukrainians talk about that, land for peace, I was just in a call a couple of weeks ago, and one of them said, well, if the Italians want land for peace, why don't they give the Italian Riviera to Putin? He'd much rather have that than Donbass. If you guys are so gung-ho, why shouldn't how about the Americans give Alaska land for peace? Why is it that we're supposed to give away our territory? So I just feel it's too imperial for me even to speculate about that. But I do think because it's our weapons and our financial assistance, I would hope that we would have a unified position if and when it gets to a right moment for negotiation. Right now, the person least interested in negotiation is Vladimir Putin, because he's escalated. He will not talk. This is my prediction now, right? I don't think there'll be any circumstance under which he will begin to negotiate until he has tried to capture the territory that he allegedly on paper annexed. And so tragically, I think this war is going to go on for a lot longer.
Thanks, Mike. And again, I'm noticing that in the Q&A, we do have Tet Tar and Patrick Dickinson, and I think their questions have one way or another been answered in your responses so far. And JD Bindernagel has reminded me or pointed out that if you scroll down in the German article, the English version is present. So JD, it'd be great if you could share that article with everyone. And I want to finish, Mike, because we are out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to come back to comparing your experiences in Moscow in the early 90s with, are there any Mike McFauls who can go to Moscow today and basically do something similar? To put this, in another way, people who tried to encourage a more pluralistic and democratic Russia in that early post-Cold War period did a lot. And I think there was an incredible amount of international enthusiasm and warmth for this new Russia at that time. And I can certainly recall that. And I wanted to just see, do you see any non-governmental opportunities today, or is Putin's hold on the country just simply too authoritarian to even contemplate those sorts of things? And this, unfortunately, will be our final question.
Okay, that's our final question. I better answer it in a smart way. I'm gonna be part analyst and part anecdotes, okay? Because I want to end on a high note. So, just on the anecdotal personal side, those were incredibly exciting times in my life. I lived in the Soviet Union, 1990, 91, 92. And I think it's important to remember that that was real history, that most Russians wanted to join the West back then. I was welcomed, Jeff, not as a usurper or as a revolutionary, as you know, Putin blamed me back as when I showed up as ambassador. I was welcomed as a hero, just because I was working with the Democratic Party, and we were embraced. We were invited by Boris Yeltsin. We weren't seeking to overthrow anything. And that's part of Russian history too. And those were Russians that helped to overthrow the Soviet Union with Ukrainians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Georgians. But, you know, I have the photos on my wall at Stanford, hundreds of thousands of Russians that were there, you know, seeking to escape Soviet imperialism and build democracy. Now, it failed. It failed in large measure because of Putin. I think a different president at that moment in history in 2000, the trajectory could have been very different. And remember, he was a completely accidental president at the time. There's nothing about Russian history or culture that said he had to be president in 2000. In fact, without the 1998 financial crash, he would not have been president. There's no doubt in my mind that without that financial crash, by the way, one that started in Asia, it didn't even start in Russia, had that not have happened, the heir apparent, everybody knew at the time, was Boris Nemtsov. That's who Yeltsin had wanted to take over for him. Had Nemtsov become president in 2000, this history would have been very, very different. He was a close personal friend of mine, tragically assassinated in 2015. He would not have gone down this path of Putin. But so that's the past. But it's important to remember, just as I said, that line about NATO tension was not this straight line, but this zigzag. This history has been a lot of zigs and zags. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Medvedev, Putin. It hasn't been just one line in one direction for 1,000 years of Russian history. And that makes me cautiously optimistic of a couple of things. First of all, can you go to Russia and do what I did? The answer to that is no. But there are lots of very talented Russians living abroad these days, doing fantastic work on media in particular, that should be, you know, that need assistance and can be helped. TV Rain just was forced out of Russia. They've reconfigured their broadcasting outside of the country. I was just on their show 2 days ago, doing fantastic work. Alexei Navalny, he's in prison. His job is to survive, literally to survive. But his group is working outside of the country and you know, on YouTube channels, and they can be assisted. And I would just say that the notion that most Russians support Putin in this war, I'm very skeptical about that. Here's the way I see it. 20% support Putin no matter what, hardliners. 20% do not support Putin, hardline against Putin. And then there's 60% in the middle that are apolitical. They don't want to hear about things. They just, you know, politics is not for them. That's the way Russia's been for many, many years, including when I was ambassador. By the way, when you see those polls that say 80% approval rating for Putin, I want you all to remember that there's a 90% non-respondence rate to most polls in Russia, 90%. So the people that are responding, guess what? They're the ones responding in the affirmative. The other thing you need to know about Russian polling, that we know from other polling of polls about polling in Russia, and I know all these firms, I've worked with them for decades. Most Russians associate pollsters with the government. They don't think of them as being independent. So they will answer their question about do they support Putin, and then they'll ask the pollster, by the way, could you tell Putin to, you know, pave my roads here out here in Irkutsk, right? So think about what that means about the accuracy of that polling. And And then the third thing I would say, and now I'm just paraphrasing something a Russian colleague of mine said, actually the founder of Doge TV, she was just at Stanford 10 days ago. And she said to me, Mike, and she said this publicly, so I don't mind sharing it with you. The war in Ukraine didn't begin in February for Russians. The war in Ukraine began in September with Putin's call for mobilization, for draft. And as many Russians have now left as have enlisted, that tells you a little bit about how popular this war actually is. And so I don't want to predict the future. You know, we're not political scientists. We're not very good at that. By the way, neither is the CIA from my time in the government. But I would say two things about a longer view of Russian history. And this is a good place to end. Number one, part analyst and then anecdote from when I was ambassador. Number one, we do know that over decades and 100 years of history, not point predictions, that the more well-to-do societies are, the more the middle class, the property class, demand that their property rights be defended. The more likely countries are, in other words, to become democratic. Back when I was ambassador, one of the slogans they would use, no taxation without representation, right? That's a slogan from the American War of Independence. Well, that's what the middle class said. You can't take our money, taxation, unless we get representation in a legitimate parliamentary election. Well, that starts, with the British, that starts in England with the English Revolution, hundreds of years of history of that kind of thinking. And we know now today, if you take out the oil exporters, 18 of the 20 richest countries in the world, GDP per capita, are democracies. That's not an accident. And Russia is one of the richest countries in the world that is not a democracy. So there's these structural forces, I think, that give people hope. But the last thing, and we have what? We have 2 minutes, right? So I'll be quick. I want to tell you an anecdote from when I was ambassador. By the way, I love being ambassador to Russia. If you ever get a chance to be an ambassador on this call, do it. I love that job. I love being a professor at Stanford, but I really love that job. And one of the jobs, Jeff, that I took public diplomacy very seriously. So I would go to companies, I would go to the Bolshoi Theater, I would go to basketball games. I was a very, very public, active ambassador. And one day I was at a Russian high-tech firm, and we were talking about cooperation with Silicon Valley, but it turned to politics, and there'd been this big demonstration just a few weeks earlier, and I asked the room, 100 people, and so these are engineers, Moscow, well-paid folks. I asked them how many people had been to that demonstration, and everybody's hands went up. Everybody in the room had been to the demonstration. But at that demonstration, there was violence. It was May 6, 2012, very famous, pivotal demonstration in Russian history. And a lot of people got arrested. A lot of people got beat up. And there was another demonstration coming. And so later in the conversation, I asked the room, how many were going to that? And like 4 people raised their hands. Repression works. People didn't want to get arrested. And right at the end of that conversation, a woman in the back interrupted me, and she said, Mr. Ambassador, I hope you're not confused by the little polling you just did. I didn't raise my hand when you asked, am I demonstrating? She said, I'm the breadwinner in my family. I can't afford to be arrested. But don't think for a moment that I've changed my views about Putin. And I think about that because, there's a lot of countries and a lot of history, 89 comes to mind, where we thought everybody was supportive of the regime, and 3 weeks later, it just disappeared. And I'm not predicting that for Putin's Russia, but I'm cautiously optimistic that there are a lot more people dissatisfied with this current course. I think Putin did overreach in Ukraine, and that will come back to haunt him. And the Navalny's of the world, I hope they survive and live to be a part of a democratic society. But I actually think that this might grow to not just the Navalny's, but the middle class people are making decisions about whether to send their sons to Ukraine or Kazakhstan. That we now measure in tens of thousands of people. And it makes me cautiously optimistic about someday there'll be a Russia that, some young Mike McFaul can go be part of a new democratic renewal.
Mike, thanks very much. I think that's, a very inspiring note to finish on, in fact. And I think all of the students who are listening to you today will be inspired by that possibility of going and doing something on the ground, but also one day being an ambassador. So, Mike, this was a fabulous talk, and you gave us a great deal to think about. It's always a pleasure to hear you talk, and thanks again. For all of our conference attendees, we are going to resume at 10:05. That's a fairly short break, but 10:05. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you all. Thanks for having me. Great conversation.
Enjoy Sicily.